Okay. Is my mic on? Hear me? Okay. Thank you very much, Fredrik, for that. I will now crowd you here. Thank you. So, thanks a lot for inviting me to hold this introductory speech in this very interesting conference. I am happy to be here, also in Gothenburg. Thank you for that. It's always nice to come to Gothenburg. So let me just let's see now. Time, yes, and this is forward, right? Yeah. So we recently presented our report called the Living Planet Report, which comes every second year, and we've been looking at these figures for the last 40, 50 years, and they're connected to our overarching goals for biodiversity and the ecological footprint. And looking at the Global Living Planet Index, which is looking at the biodiversity, there has been since 1970 a decline of 52% in biodiversity. And if you look at freshwater ecosystems, it's even worse. It's up to three quarters, 76%, something like that, lost biodiversity populations, which is, of course, very discouraging. Looking at the ecological footprint, it is as bad, but going the other way. It's this shows the number of planets that we need for our way of living. And already around 1970, we really passed the productivity of the Earth, of the planet, meaning that we are borrowing from our children and from coming generations. And today we use the equivalent of 1.5 planet, Earth, every year. And this is the mean, the average for the whole planet, for the whole population of 7 billion. So looking at Sweden, we use like 3.5 planets, the way of living, and you have countries that are even worse, of course. And you see a lot of it is made up of the carbon footprint. So that is what has also increased the most, the carbon footprint. So this is really important as a background to what I'm going to say. And just WWF's, our meta goals, is looking at these footprints and biodiversity, and we need really to by 2050, for example, stay within the Earth's capacity, and it's a long way to go to do that. And for biodiversity, the same, getting sound and stable ecosystems. I'm not going to get into these in detail, but these are our meta goals. And WWF, we exist in more than 100 countries around the world, and close to 6,000 people working. And Sweden is actually, if you talk about fundraising, the 5th largest WWF office in the world, with less than 10 million people in the country. So we are quite an important office in Sweden, actually. Okay, let me just go a little historical look at this from a Swedish point of view. And according to Nordic mythology, there was this tree called Yggdrasil. It was an ash tree, and this tree was actually the universe according to the Nordic mythology. You had the different kinds of universe in this big tree, right? And the two first humans, according to that mythology, were Ask and Embla, meaning the ash tree and the oak tree, really, and it's very close to the Adam and Eve, of course, and so on. But the fact is that in Swedish gardens, Swedish farm gardens, there has always been kind of a tree of life put into the garden. So trees have been important, are still very important in Swedish culture. And if you talk about agroforestry, maybe you think a lot about what is happening in Africa and parts of Asia and so on. But in fact, looking at the last couple of thousand years in Sweden, agroforestry has been a very important part of our culture and of our production in many ways. And if you're not familiar with it, I just would mention that if you, for example, in your agriculture, use the nutrients coming from the forest by having cattle grazing in the forest, bringing the cattle and the manure to the crop and the crop field, you're using there's an interaction between the forest and the agricultural land, and in a way that could be looked upon as some kind of an agroforestry perspective, really. And this is actually the starting point of what is happening in many places of the world today, in Madagascar or many places where it's you just cut down the forest to get some cropland. And this was used to maybe cut down the trees and cultivate and have a crop of some kind of rye, for example. Hard work, of course. I'm just going to go through these pictures. And you see cattle grazing in the forest land. And this was made in different ways in southern Sweden and in northern Sweden, but the phenomena was both in southern Sweden and in northern Sweden. And actually, the landscape in many places was kind of a savanna-like landscape. I'm not sure where this is, but I would guess this is the island of Gotland, where I lived for 5-6 years, where you still today have a lot of grazing in the forest land, actually. And this is these are the eastern escarpments of Lake Witrén. It's a managed biosphere area, not far from here, 200 kilometers, not even that, 180 kilometers to the east of here, which is also a landscape of agroforestry in many ways, actually. It's a big lake, one of the biggest lakes in Europe, very deep, and you have these escarpments of forest, but in between them you have agricultural land with a lot of different kinds of agroforestry like areas, really, with grazing, and you also take leaves from the trees for the cattle. Another example is from northern Sweden, where you have I don't know the English word, but it's called fäbodbruk. But that's when you up in the hilly parts of northern Sweden, and you have the special cattle of sheep and cattle that graze in these areas, which also kind of an agroforestry, really. Even some kind of cattle that is only specialized for these kind of areas. So humans have for thousands of years lived in forest and agriculture dynamic systems all over the world, also in Sweden. And I talked about the forest grazing in Sweden in the beginning of the 19th century, but it goes way back. As well as for example, in Zambia, this is the Miombo forest, the dry forest, shifting cultivation in Zambia, and this is to these days. I think it says 2012 there. Should it be? But when we look at things, we tend to look at things like this. It's either forest or it's agricultural land. And we perceive a very clear divide between the forest and the agricultural land. And this might look that it's extremely a clear divide. But even in this kind of a landscape, you have ingredients that come close to some kind of agroforestry without even knowing it. For example, there were studies from Costa Rica. We talked about Costa Rica here recently and today, and there was a study that small fragments of forest, only like 150 hectares or so, had the economical importance of around $60,000 a year just for being there, for pollination and interacting with the agricultural land. So even if looks like there is a very clear divide, and there is forest and there is agricultural land, you have the interaction, sometimes without even knowing. And I think these things are good to remember when we talk about what is agroforest, what is agroforestry. It's terrible, isn't it? We also from WWF have recently decided on a forest vision I want to mention, and we really see upon the forest as a important part, because it's a world enriched by resilient forest ecosystems is a value for their contribution to human welfare and sustained life on Earth. So the forests are extremely important, of course, because we often forget how many people that really depend on the forest. There is around, you say, 1.6 billion people more or less dependent on forest and supported by forest, and around 300 million people living inside the forest, and many, many more, of course, that are interacting with the forest. But it is in the border between the forest and the agricultural land, the interface, that it becomes really important and interesting. Cool ice. And looking for example at Kenya, 1963, close to 12% of forest cover. And 50 years later, less than 2%. And in Sweden, we have moved from the other direction. I mean, looking at southern Sweden, for example, 150 years ago, the forest cover was very low, and today in all of Sweden, it's close to 60%. So let's see. And this is what happens a lot in many places. It is the collecting of fuel wood. And it's really important because that's the way you cook in many places today. You collect the fuel wood and you cook your food in sometimes very, very old-fashioned stoves, with which is not good for health or anything. And it's a lot of work for children and for women. And let me now get into a few examples on connected to WWF. And I want to start with this one. It's from the Virunga Mountains, the borders between Congo and Rwanda and Uganda. And this is actually from DRC. And this is a project that really focuses on the charcoal, because this is the biggest threat here, except for now the big oil companies, of course, which is a really big threat. But another threat is the illegal logging for charcoal production. So this is a small scale project, really, with tree planting for small landowners, but also for larger landowners. Tree planting up to 10 to 20 hectares, making up actually to close to 10% of the whole reforested area, and with the aim to reduce the charcoal illegal logging. And it's connected to agroforestry in the way that we plant the cocoa, which can grow in below the tree canopy, right, in more dense and more shadows. So there is the connection between the tree production, the wood production, and the cocoa production and the agroforestry. And today there are 6,000 hectares reforested here, and of those 6,000 hectares, 900 are some kind of an agroforestry part. And this is quite new. So the first harvest was now in 2013. Another example from Nepal, and that is the Sagarmatha. I don't know how it's pronounced, but maybe like that. Yeah, community agroforestry project in Nepal. You see the nursery there was established in 1982, but this project is from 1996, and it's a multi-faceted community-based conservation project in Nepal to address the deforestation, of course, and also to build on the local capacity for people in the communities. Another example is from Vietnam. Also planting of cocoa beneath the tree canopy. So there is again the combination of using the incoming sunlight for the tree production, the wood production, and the cocoa production underneath. And it's also supported by Vietnamese authorities, who say that this is really the way to do it, and not to put it into monoculture, but into agroforestry investments. Another one from Brazil, Bahia, and this is in the Atlantic forest, which are among the most threatened ecosystems in the world, with enormous biodiversity, endemic species, and so on. And in these areas live around 120 million Brazilians. So it's really densely populated, but it's also very it's very threatened, but it's also very much used by humans. And this is an example of, as you see, Guarana. But there is also the cocoa also here used in the agroforestry. And Guarana has, as I studied this morning, it's twice the amount of caffeine as coffee, really, and used in many of these modern drinks today, right? Energy drinks that people go to the gym, so they use that to get very enthusiastic when they lift weights. And finally, also, this is from the Philippines, where WWF and National Geographic have formed an alliance to combat deforestation. You know, the Philippines, as you know, has many challenges these days. Not only the Haiyan, but it's close to 140 million people, and it's very vulnerable areas all over these fantastic islands. But among them deforestation, and there is also included a lot of deforestation, combating deforestation with agroforestry here. This is my final example from Madagascar. I returned from Madagascar only 2 weeks ago, and it's striking the poverty in many places of Madagascar and how dry it is these days. But it's also a place where we have a couple of 200,000 hectares in this area, with integrated agroforestry, integrating it with the markets and to combat the poverty and the poverty alleviation. I just wanted to make a look back also. You mentioned I was in Australia a long time ago, almost 30 years ago. I worked in this sheep farm, and they actually had these agroforestry systems also there, with radiata pine and cattle and sheep grazing in between. But they also had to, this was also part of the fire schemes to combat the fire, because it's a real danger in Australian forests, as you know. I will end here. This is a bit complicated picture perhaps, but I just wanted to show you that if you look at this is business as usual. If we don't do anything, if we go on like we do today, we estimate that we, until 2050, will lose 232 million hectares of natural forest, and another 242 million hectares converted to managed forest. So that is the estimation that we do if we don't do anything, business as usual. But there are different scenarios here. This is a scenario that we are looking to try to achieve which means that we actively actually convert natural forest to some kind of a managed forest or plantations. And we as an environmental organization, we say it's necessary. It's necessary because people have to have better conditions for their livelihood. But if we do that, we will also reduce the loss of natural forest. So this is, with open eyes, something that we see has to be done. And we could talk more about that, but we don't have the time. I just wanted to point out that this is something we as an environmental organization really are facing and with open eyes want to do and achieve. And it's not well taken all the time, but it's necessary. So thank you.
Thank you, Director Witrén, for this global and historical exposé of WWF. Impressive activities all around the globe, actually. Now it's time for the floor to ask questions. So please use the time, because Director Witrén, he will not join us during the later part of the afternoon. So please present your name and your affiliation.
My name is Mattias Jonsson. I'm from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences in Uppsala. So I have a question regarding exotic versus native trees. And in a lot of the sort of promoted agroforestry trees in the past has been exotic trees. And if you go to a lot of the sort of agroforestry landscapes, that actually they are now, okay, they have more trees, but they are actually dominated by a few often exotic trees. How do you see that that problem? I think that's something that's maybe received too little attention, and that we are not sort of making the most use out of those trees in terms of biodiversity conservation and so on.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's interesting and important one. I think we as a network and organization, we have, I think, to be honest, we have different views around the globe. And maybe it also has to be like that because it differs from where you are. In Sweden, for example, we have we are quite reluctant to look on exotic species in the Swedish landscape. We think that we have excellent forest trees already in Sweden, and I don't think we have a one single opinion in the network about this. Of course, there are. It's the same thing if we look at oil palm plantations, for example. They are not evil. I mean, they are. It's an extremely effective species, oil palms. But the problem is that it's when it's cultivated in a way, land grabbing and so on, where you get the big problems. So it's not the species of itself that is the bad thing, right? You need. We say you need to have palm oil plantations, and I think. I wouldn't be surprised if we would be able to find an opinion that would include that also in agroforestry sometimes. But I couldn't tell you how that opinion or that position looks exactly today. That's a fluffy answer, but sorry, we don't have one single position on this.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, Golia Kimanzo from the Salvation Army. Håkan, initially you said one of the biggest issues we have is one of the big ecological footprints is carbon, and you presented various agroforestry projects we have across the globe. Are there any that are carbon offsets, and if so, what is your experience with that scheme to pay farmers directly to plant trees to offset carbon?
You mean specific agroforestry or planting trees in general?
Both.
Both.
If you can.
Okay. Yeah. So. I mean, forest and forestry and forest products are really, to us, important part of combating climate change. But we don't see it as the sole salvator, because it's we are in a hurry. We have to, in the coming decades, change the whole way of living. And sometimes when you look at the carbon offset and the good use of tree production and carbon offsetting and so on, it's sometimes the gain of that comes later, especially in boreal areas where you have a lot of carbon bound to in the soil, right? So you have to be careful. You have to decide what is the time perspective that is the important one, and that's why we say forest and forestry products are really important for climate change combating. But it has to be within the sustainability. It has to be sustainable, really. It's the same with hydropower or anything, right? So we really need to increase a lot of other energy production, like solar and wind and so on, of course, also.
So one final question in the back. You could please take it during your presentation. Is that okay? Yep.
Thank you, Kenneth Hermele, School of Global Studies. I was intrigued by the last slide you showed, the one before the panda bear, where you had the scenarios. There is something there you call diet shift, which would influence the use of forests and forest covers very much. How do you explain that? Could you explain that to me?
Thank you for the question. I'm sorry, I cannot explain it. I don't know I don't know every one of these scenarios. What I wanted to show was that one of the main scenarios and one of the scenarios that we really think is a good way forward means that we as an environmental organization say yes to turning forest into plantations sometimes. That's what I was wanting to show you, that it's not as easy to say no to everything, right? They are included there, yeah, as well. But I mean, managed forests look very different all over the world. I mean, you have managed forests in Sweden that look very different from for example, eucalypt plantations in Brazil, of course. But it's still, these are included here, yes.
You have a reference for a report as well, down to the left. So
yeah, this is actually a part of the Living Forest report.
Yeah.
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 Don't you think that this diet shift is simply that you cut down on the clearing forest for cattle production? That is what I mean. I mean, we reduce meat consumption.
I'm sorry, but I have to cut the discussions here. I'm not sure it's going to help
Read
us
the
for
report.
the afternoon, but it's quite complicated, and it's IASA that has done the modeling behind this one. So please go to the report, and we can conclude that WWF says that we do need palm oil plantation, and we do need to convert natural forest to managed forest as well. So thank you very much for this, and Håkan will join us for lunch. So please feel free to speak more to him during the lunch. And now it's time for the next speaker. We're good.